Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for making the time to join us today. My name is Denise Thomas, and I'm the founder and owner of The Effective Communication Coach. I am so excited. I'm so honored to welcome you to the Milwaukee Public Museum's Milwaukee's Fight for Social Change interview series, happening in conjunction with the extraordinary special exhibit, Mandela, the Official Exhibition. Our interview today will look back at Milwaukee's rich history of Black liberatory struggle. And to help us do so today, we are joined by the Mr. Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson is a co-founder and lead trainer consultant for Nurturing Diversity Partners, which is a consultancy firm that fosters diversity, inclusion, and equity within institutions and communities. They educate groups about the history, social cultural dynamics, personal skills, and institutional practices that build a more equitable society. Reggie has been a much sought after speaker, researcher, and writer for over a decade. He is regionally known and nationally known. His work has helped institutions and individuals understand how our country's racial hierarchy developed historically, its impact on our lives today, and how we can realize America's promise for all citizens. Reggie shares seldom sold stories and facts about the experiences of African Americans and other people of color, past and present. He writes and provides background on current racial issues to regional, national, and international media. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Reggie Jackson. Good morning, Reggie. How are you?
Denise, I'm wonderful. So good to be in the space with everyone. So good to be in the space with you, and your enthusiasm is just making me like, man, I'm really ready to go. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for the kind words. We are honored to have your wisdom and be fortunate to have you on a Monday morning. So thank you again. So I know many people in this session, they don't want to hear me talk. They just want to hear me ask questions to, again, gain your knowledge and expertise. So are you ready to get started with this incredible conversation?
Absolutely, Denise.
All right. So I know I read your bio, but outside of the formal bio, please share with our viewers about yourself and the work that you do in the community, and actually, how did you become this highly regarded, sought after expert regarding racism and the evolution? So tell us about yourself and your journey.
Well, actually, the journey in doing this specific work started nearly 20 years ago when I volunteered at America's Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee, founded by James Cameron, who survived a lynching at the age of 16 in Marion, Indiana, and opened America's Black Holocaust Museum in 1988 at the age of 74. And so I volunteered at the museum in the summer of 2002 and was trained as one of the griots at the museum. And griot is a term the museum used instead of docents. We are literally the walking embodiment of the oral historians, the keepers of the history of West African lore. And so I became one of the griots in 2002. By 2003, I became the head griot, started to do the training for the other griots, became very immersed in getting to know Dr. Cameron really well. He became my mentor, started to travel around the country doing work on behalf of the museum. And that just kind of continued to grow over the years. Eventually started Nurturing Diversity Partners with my friend, Dr. Fran Kaplan. And, you know, I've also worn a couple other hats in addition to the work that I've done as the former head griot. I've resigned that position last year with the museum. I also write. I'm a columnist, the senior columnist for the Milwaukee Independent, an online magazine. So I've been writing for the Milwaukee Independent for about 5 years now. And so I've gotten a lot of really positive feedback on my my work in the columns that I write, looking at the intersection of race and a variety of other social issues in our country. And it just kind of continues to grow. In 2016, we had the civil unrest in Sherman Park, where Seville Smith was shot. That was literally right around the corner from my house. And I wrote an article about that called Evidence of Things Unknown. And as a result of that article going viral, ended up being interviewed by people from around the world, media from around the world. And it's just kind of continued. I've become known kind of as Milwaukee's segregation expert, as I've done a series called The Hidden Impact of Segregation. And so that's kind of how I've gotten into this space.
Wow, that's an incredible pathway, and it most definitely, excuse me, it makes sense in terms of why you are who you are. Now, as we, again, are having a series all week regarding the Milwaukee fight, not just the country's fight, but specifically the Milwaukee's fight for social change, one of the questions that I want to ask you, Mr. Jackson, is, from your lens, from your expertise, from your research, when did the struggle for racial justice in Milwaukee first begin?
Well, actually began like right when Milwaukee became Milwaukee back in the 1840s. There was a struggle of African-American men to have the right to vote. The first election held in the state of Wisconsin in 1835, a Black man by the name of Joe Oliver voted in that election, but it would be 31 years before Black men would be allowed to vote again. 1866, Ezekiel Gillespie challenged, basically, it wasn't really even a law or a rule. It was just kind of the Wisconsin Elections Commission just said, we're not going to allow Black men to vote, even though there was a referendum on the ballot in 1849 that said, yeah, Black men should have the right to vote. Wisconsin Election Commission ignored that and said, we're not going to allow you guys to vote. So Ezekiel Gillespie challenged it in 1866 and became the second Black person to vote in the state. And so the struggle has continued over the course of time. And then, of course, it picked up in earnest in the 1960s as the fight against segregated schools in Milwaukee continued, the fight against unfair housing practices, the fight against employment discrimination. So it really began to manifest itself in a larger way in 1960 as the Black population, had grown, from about 9,000 people in 1940 to over 62,000 by 1960. So there were a lot of Black people here, and they were wondering why they didn't have things the same way that whites did. And so they decided to fight against these unfair practices.
You bring up a great point, Reggie, and it really resonates, because if you fast forward to current state, based on the continuous injustices that impact the Black community, there are a lot of individuals from outside communities or from different communities, in particular the white community, that are wanting to know, what can we do as part of this activism? So if you could just elaborate in terms of what was the response during that time frame in the 60s from the white community, and what have you seen evolve from that time to present date within the white community?
Well, unfortunately, back in the 1960s, Denise, the white community did not take civil rights activity by Blacks in Milwaukee as something that was a positive. In fact, they saw it as something that was very negative. They fought against it tooth and nail in every way, shape, or form you can imagine. Milwaukee Board of School Directors, instead of realizing that the growth of the Black student population necessitated the need to build more schools on the north side of Milwaukee, which is where Black people were living. Instead, they built new schools on the south side. So the schools on the north side became overcrowded. Black students were actually bused to the south side in a policy known as intact busing, which most people in Milwaukee have never heard of. And literally what they did is they took Black children from overcrowded schools on the north side, shipped them to schools on the south side, but kept them separate from their white peers. They had no classes together, no recess, no lunch, nothing. They oftentimes didn't even see each other. In some schools, they actually had a trailer on the playground where the Black students were taught, and they brought their Black teachers with them. Black teachers weren't allowed to teach white students. And so that was one way that Milwaukee Board of School Directors showed that they didn't really care that Blacks were boycotting the schools in 1964 because of segregation. So really the white community did not take it very well when you started to see the open housing marches that started in August of 1967, those 200 consecutive days of marching. That first day that they marched across the 16th Street Viaduct, trying to open up housing throughout the city of Milwaukee, not just the South Side, but also the North Side. You know, Black people up till 1960 were not really even allowed to live north of Capitol Drive in Milwaukee. Can you imagine that? And so that first day, they were met by a mob of thousands of angry white people on the south side of the 16th Street Viaduct. They were throwing bricks, bottles, bags of feces, bags of urine, every racial epithet you can imagine, telling them to go back to Africa. All of these things they heard from this very large contingent of counter protesters. And the police were there, but they were, very small number of police. And the police basically told them, we can't really protect you guys. There were 250 marchers and, somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 angry white people on the other side of the bridge. But that didn't deter the people that wanted to open up housing. They said, well, listen, we're going to come back tomorrow. And they came back the next day, and that mob had grown. It was twice the size that it was that first day, but they continued to march for 200 consecutive days. And you started to have counter protests around the city. You started to see white people protesting, Black people, asking for equal treatment. So some of the things they started to do, the local neo-Nazis here, I guess they weren't neo-Nazis at that time, they were just Nazis, started to have marches themselves. Members of the Ku Klux Klan started to march as counter protesters. As Blacks were marching, they'd be on the other side of the street as counter protesters. The police department at that time, we had a chief of police, Harold Breyer, who was known by the Black community as exceptionally racist. They called him the Bull Connor of the North. And so the police department didn't do a great deal to protect those marchers. Instead, the NAACP Youth Council commandos, young Black teenagers and young Black men were actually the ones that were there to protect the marchers. And over the course of time, there were some whites like Father James Groppe who joined the efforts, but most whites, though, they weren't happy about the marches. They weren't happy about the protests, and they didn't really appreciate or join in. And of course, nowadays we see a complete shift in that. When the protests started last year after George Floyd's killing, you saw a great deal of diversity among people who were, protesting for Black lives. And so that's a huge shift. That's a big difference. But of course, over the course of time, we see that those people who are woke, don't necessarily do something once they're woke. I wrote an article last year. I said, it's great that you're woke, but are you going to get out of the bed and do something? Because what generally happens is people join in the emotional connection early on, but then they kind of lose faith and they don't participate in the same way any longer.
Reggie, you bring up an extraordinary point, which is a great segue into the next topic that I would love for you to expand on. And that is, in terms of current day, they're obviously, as part of our fight, Milwaukee's fight for social justice, a necessity to keep fighting. And as our great late Congressman John Lewis had habitually talked about, was good trouble. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us some of the tactics that were used in terms of activism outside of protesting as relates to the fight for social justice? And from your lens as a historian regarding social justice change, what are some of the ways that our current generation of activists can demonstrate just that?
Well, back in the 1960s in Milwaukee, one of the things that was a part of the struggle was the segregated nature of schools in Milwaukee. We didn't have any formal policy like the Jim Crow laws in the South that mandated separate schools for Blacks and whites, but we literally had separate schools for Black and white children. So an organization, kind of community members came together and they boycotted the schools on a number of occasions in 1964. Literally, tens of thousands of Black children said, we're not going to go to schools until you fix the schools. In addition to that, an attorney by the name of Lloyd Barbie filed a lawsuit against the city, the Milwaukee Board of School Directors, mandating that they should, listen to what the Brown versus Board of Education decision said about integrating the schools, even though they didn't legally have policy in place. In the real world, they were still segregating children. So he filed a lawsuit. You also had Alderwoman Vale Phillips, who was elected in 1956, the first female alderperson in Milwaukee, the first person of color who was an alderperson. She actually ran an election where she didn't put her picture on any of her campaign material, and people thought that she was a man. And so she ended up winning an election, and she, immediately began to push back against some of the policies. There were 19 members of the Common Council at the time, and she started in 1962 to push them to pass a fair housing ordinance in Milwaukee that had some teeth to it instead of the weak one that was in place. And so she was outvoted 18-1 each time. And so, we were able to see all of these different mechanisms outside of just the protests that people had, filing lawsuits, putting pressure on elected officials, boycotting, members of the Common Council, and even the County Board of Supervisors who were promoting, racist practices. So there are a lot of things that people did. And I think, as we look at what young people do today, those people who were activists, I always say this when I was a teacher. I taught my students that when you look back on the civil rights movement in Milwaukee, don't look at Father Groppe, don't look at Vale Phillips, don't look at Lloyd Barbie, look at all of those young people who were participants, who were the marchers, who were the ones that were promoting all these things, because that's the way you connect young people to that period of time in history. It was way before they were born, but they can see themselves in the young people. They can look at a young man like Prentice McKinney, who was this young guy who was one of the youth commandos, and still just a great guy. I love having conversations with him about those things that happened in those stories. And I always say that we should use the power of young people then to promote the power of young people today, because they weren't afraid.
Oh, wait a minute. No, wait a minute, Reggie. That was a hashtag. I need you to say that one more time. That was a powerful statement that we need to underscore. I hope that we can somehow send that in our YouTube chat. Please repeat that last statement.
Which one? They were not afraid?
The young people that we need, the young people need to look at. You said something in terms of the young people. Yes.
Oh, the young people today need to look at the young people back in the 1960s and realize that power that they had is the power that they have. The same in Birmingham with Dr. King. Dr. King was nearly kicked out of Birmingham by Black leaders because he was using the kids as protesters, and they were very angry, but guess what? It was very successful. Young people have power that they don't realize they have, and I always advocate for young people when I talk to young people. Listen, you have power. You don't realize you have power, but when you realize it, use it, and you are going to be the change agents moving forward. I can't hear you, Denise. You've gone silent for some reason. I can't hear you at all. I wish I could read lips.
Let me try again.
Okay, I hear you now.
Okay, what is the power that our youth have that you referenced? Because I know a lot of young people are going to be watching this and they're going to think, okay, well, what is that power that I have that I don't know? Help us understand what that power is.
Well, first of all, the power of intelligence. Young people are very intelligent. They're very inquisitive. They want to see a world that looks a very specific way for them. Listen, this is what happens. Adults oftentimes don't listen to young people, right? We say, well, you're too young, you haven't experienced enough, you don't really know what you're talking about. I've always been the exact opposite. I've always told my students when I was a teacher to question everything, to put your voice ahead of the voices of adults, because you are fighting for the world you want to see, not the world they want to see. You can't use necessarily the tactics that worked for them back in the 60s. You can't necessarily use the same tactics because the world has changed. So what you do is you use your intelligence, your intellect, your ability to connect with, think about it. Back at that time, if you wanted to connect with someone, you literally had to pick up the phone or go to their house. Now you can grab your electronic device and you can communicate with people around the planet instantaneously. So they have the power of social media. They have the power of instant communication with each other. They can get a group of people together to do something in a way that we could never even imagine, even when I was younger. So they have that power. They're very intelligent. they have a voice that's different than the voice of elders in our community. They have to understand that, listen, even though some of the elders may not listen to them, that does not mean that they should silence themselves. I've always said that change occurs very slowly, but the changes in our society that we need to see today are going to be the changes that benefit these young people when they become adults, they become parents, they become grandparents. So they're literally fighting for their future. They're not fighting for my future. They're fighting for their future. And they have to understand that they are going to be the ones 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that we're going to be talking about as the pioneers of Milwaukee that led us out of the current situation we're in.
I love it. Thank you for saying that, because as a young person, many, many years ago, I was always curious as to what power I did have. And to your point, when we reflect on the incredible game changers of social justice in this country, many have been under the age of 40, many have been under the age of 30. So I'm so appreciative of you reiterating the power that our young people have, despite what the society narrative typically is in terms of young people sit down, let the elders take care of it. And quite frankly, the older that we become, yes, we become wiser, but the energy, the capacity. So we should definitely in Milwaukee embrace the fact that we have some incredible young future leaders that can make the pathway and continue to fight for civil rights. Now, we've got about 10 more minutes, Reggie. I'm sure I speak for everyone who's watching this video. We could literally tap into your mind, your incredible genius mind, until midnight. But because we have 10 minutes, I want to make sure that we talk about next steps based on your knowledge and your expertise. So if you could share with us, what does Milwaukee's civil rights struggle tell us about the power and limitations of voting and legislation and direct action in the city of Milwaukee?
Well, I think one of the things we have to always do is look back on the past. And we always talk about milestones, right? So we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches. But I tell people, if you look back on what happened after the marches ended, after the ordinance was passed, you realize that nothing really changed in Milwaukee in terms of the South Side. There was a special census done in 1975 that showed the South Side of Milwaukee. Most of those neighborhoods still had single-digit Blacks in those neighborhoods. So despite the fact that we tell everybody that the open housing campaign and the 200 days of marching were really, really successful, it wasn't successful on the South Side. Now, it was successful on the North Side and on the west side of Milwaukee, but it didn't work on the south side. And the reason it didn't work on the south side is because you didn't awaken people's hearts and minds in a way on the south side that they were willing to have Black residents living next to them. And so that's still something that we struggle with today. We know that we had, the Federal Fair Housing Act passed that year, local housing ordinance passed. We had a state ordinance that was already on the books. And we put a great deal of faith in those laws. But I tell people, laws are useless if they're not enforced. And when we look at the issue of housing discrimination today, it still continues, and it continues in the same way in many respects, but in a different way, because we think that just because we pass a law, then everything is going to be all good. We think that because Lloyd Barbie filed a lawsuit to integrate Milwaukee schools, that everything was going to be, copacetic after that. But Milwaukee schools are more segregated today than they were back in the 1960s. Whites are 36% of the population in the city of Milwaukee, but only 11% of the kids in MPS are white students. So our schools are still segregated despite the lawsuit. Our housing is still the most segregated housing in the metropolitan area. Milwaukee is most segregated in the country, despite state, federal, and local laws. We have to do more than that. We have to push and understand that just passing laws is not the end of the struggle.
Reggie, you talked about voting, you've talked about housing, you've talked about access to fair and adequate public education as part of the areas of civil rights focus. What has changed? What are the top 3 areas of focus as it relates to our Black community, civil rights, and social justice? And if there hasn't been any change, what do you think, based on your experience, that we need to do in order to continue driving the social justice?
Well, yeah, I think one that's right in the forefront is policing in Milwaukee. Listen, the Black community and the police department of Milwaukee didn't get along in the 1960s. They still don't get along today. And I've argued that it's not about reforming the police. It's really about changing the mindset of how we police. We shouldn't look at our police officers as police. They should be peace officers, right? And so part of what we have is we have a mindset within policing in general in the United States that hasn't shifted. We could pass all of these reforms and laws and more training for police, but unless we change the actual nature of how we police and look at the examples of how policing is done in some other countries, then we're never going to fix that problem. The other problem, which I think is really incredibly important, is housing. Listen, only 27% of Black people in the city of Milwaukee own their homes. And that's not because Black people don't want to become homeowners or Black people don't have good credit. There's a lot of Black people that were cheated out of their homes when you had all these predatory lenders that came into Milwaukee in the 1990s, the 2000s, and literally took a great many Blacks who were homeowners who had paid for their homes, convinced them to get a second mortgage, right? And they cheated them out of their homes and they ended up losing their homes. So, the progress we had made in terms of becoming a larger percentage of homeowners in Milwaukee shifted because of this predatory lending. And everybody blames the people who got these bad loans, these subprime loans, even though they were eligible for prime loans, they blame them instead of blaming the banks that took advantage of them. And then lastly, I think it's incredibly important to understand that it's not just about voting. I always say this, I hate when people go vote and they put that little sticker on their shirt that said I voted, because that's just the easy part of the process. The next part of the process is, okay, you voted. Who did you vote for and what are you going to do after you vote? Are you going to email them, text them, send them letters and ask them, because they said they were going to do A, B, and C during the campaign, but they appear to be doing X, Y, and Z instead. Are you going to hold them accountable? Are you going to say, listen, you made promises during the campaign, you walked around and you kissed babies and all this other stuff to get me to vote for you, but what are you doing? We have to not just worry about voting, but voting for the right people who are actually going to do what they said they're going to do. And if they don't, find somebody else to vote for, because we consistently find a pattern of people voting for people and not challenging or following what those people do after they get in office. That is the symptom of people not being politically aware. It's not just about voting, it's about following those people. They are our elected representatives. They're supposed to be our voice, not their voice. They're supposed to be our voice, but we don't hold them accountable for that.
Reggie, this is incredible. I love this conversation because you're giving us actual actions that we can take. I love the accountability in terms of, now that I voted, now what? I need to hold my elected officials accountable. And quite frankly, even though we may not have, the person that we voted for may not have won, we still, to your point, need to hold the elected officials accountable. Emailing, making phone calls, holding accountable to your say-do ratio, what you said you were going to do to what actually you're doing. I love that. I'm actually going to take that as a mental note. I'm going to make time to hold my elected officials accountable at both a local, emphasis local, based on your recommendations, and state level as it relates to social justice and change here in Milwaukee. All right, so last question for you, Reggie. And again, this has been so incredibly helpful. And we appreciate unsung heroes such as yourself, because your knowledge and your wisdom and your direction is exactly what we need and have needed, quite frankly. What are 3 things you want to leave with the audience today as it relates to the theme of the Milwaukee Public Museum's interview series, or Milwaukee's fight for social justice? 3 things, 60 seconds. Give us your thoughts, please.
Question everything, re-educate yourself, and then teach other people what you've learned. That's the key to moving us forward, because if we don't learn the correct history of how we got to where we are, then we have no chance of coming up with policies and practices that are going to move us forward. So many of us are cheated in our history classes. We don't know the true history because we leave out all the ugly stuff. Re-educate yourself. Question everything that you hear. Don't just accept things because some talking head says this is what it is, and do the research yourself. and then re-educate yourself, and then take what you learn and teach other people. Have those productive conversations with other people.
I love it. Thank you so much, Reggie. And as Reggie talks about educating yourself, please make sure that you take advantage of the Milwaukee Public Museum in partnership with the America's Black Holocaust Museum special exhibit, Mandela, the official exhibition. Go see it today. Make the time. Mr. Jackson, thank you so much. Again, we have Reggie Jackson, co-founder and lead trainer consultant for Nurturing Diversity Partners. It has been a pleasure. We appreciate you sharing your time, your knowledge, and your wisdom. Thank you so
Denise.
much. Have a great day,
Denise.
Reggie.
And please go see the exhibit. My wife and I saw it a week and a half ago. It's phenomenal. Please go see it.
Thanks again. We will do that. Thank you.
Okay.